happening? Welcome in the Matt Bernier Show. My name is Matt Bernier. You can follow me on Twitter, @Bernier_Matt. This is the preview edition. Going to be a little bit of a different view of things. We're going to go back and take a look at some of the comments left beneath the YouTube player coming out of the recap edition of the Preakness. So a couple of questions, couple of comments that I wanted to touch on. Seemed like there was a pretty good response when I did this for the Derby. Had enough of them going through for the Preakness, so I figured we'll touch on those here. And then at the end, we'll go over a brief sort of early look ahead to the Belmont Stakes with some horses that are possibilities to run at Belmont Park 2 weeks from now if you're listening to this on Thursday or Friday or over this upcoming weekend, the weekend of May the 25th. However you listen to this thing, thanks for doing so. YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, video.drf.com, Spotify, however you listen. Please rate, review, and subscribe on YouTube. Make sure the bell icon's lit up so you get everything that we have to offer from DRFTV. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave them beneath the YouTube player, the video player on YouTube, or over on Twitter directly to me @Bernier_Matt. I'm pulling these from the YouTube channel, so feel free to leave comments, questions, anything, whatever it may be. I usually do go through, take a look. For all of those of you that gave sort of the thumbs up, well done on the pick, thank you. I'm not going to go over those here in the comments, but I do acknowledge that I did see most of those. But I thought there were a couple interesting ones that we can touch on. So let's start off here with a comment from Greg Riesland. I thought the patience made a difference. I assume he's talking about the ride on War of Will. I tried Everfast thinking it's near the end of May. He had to pop sometime. Dale does only get them to pop once a blue moon, though. Keep in mind, I'm reading just strictly what the comment said. I'm not trying to rephrase things. Also, tracks seemed fair. The track's times were all off, though. Yes, Improbable is the Mohaymen dialed in of the group. First things first, good call on Everfast, Greg, because there's, as I said in the recap, there was no scenario where I could have found that horse. You could have given me $1 million to play with, and I don't think I would have had him in second in any sort of wager, any sort of circumstance, because I thought he was very difficult to find. But I think you bring up a good point, or at least it's something that I know I overlook much too much, and I think in handicapping, we don't really talk about it as much as we should. You know, all of these horses, they turn their next age on January the 1st. But we all recognize that they don't all they're not foaled on January 1. So there are those instances where you have some of those foals that are January foals. And look, there are occasions where there are May foals, and they're all going to run against each other because they're still technically all 3-year-olds. I do think maybe that's something that I should be keeping a little bit more of an eye on. And I'd be curious to know if any of you that handicap, do you specifically look for the foal date, particularly with these early 3-year-olds? Where is it a scenario where a horse, do we find a major difference between a horse that is 4 months older than some of his contemporaries? And does that horse that's 4 months older, keep in mind, we're at a point now where they can take just tremendous jumps from month to month. They're still very young. They're all lightly raced. I mean, is that gap in sort of foaling, is that a big difference? Is that something that we can kind of, I don't want to say quantify, but is it something that we can use from a handicapping standpoint? I know I overlook it. I don't even really give it a second glance, but it is an interesting point, an interesting case. And the reason I thought of it is because, as you said, that it's nearing the end of May. He had to pop it sometime. I didn't see it, and I'm curious. I haven't looked at it. I don't know what the foaling month of Everfast is, but maybe that's something to keep in mind going forward. As far as the comp to Improbable with Mohaymen dialed in, I hadn't really looked at it that way, but realistically, it's an example of what I was saying, that it feels like he just hasn't really improved Improbable. And when you look at Mohaymen, you look at dialed in, as good as they were early on, they never really seem to get any better. And I always make that analogy. It's the little leaguer that's, 6 feet tall and throws 70 miles an hour when all the other kids, are barely 5 feet tall and they can't keep up with that. Well, when the 6 foot tall kid doesn't get any bigger and doesn't really get any stronger, or much stronger anyway, and all the other kids start to come up, and then all of a sudden, not only do they get as good as him, but they pass him because he is just sort of plateaued. That to me is sort of the argument for some of these 3-year-olds. So good comment there from Greg. A Sincere JNN. Here's the comment. So here we have it. I don't want to say it again. This is the best war front. Had Tyler stayed on the rail in the Derby, second for sure. Max did dig in. All right, a couple things here. I don't necessarily agree that for sure this horse, War of Will, ends up running second if Tyler Gaffalione stays on the rail. My logic going into the Derby with War of Will was he's going to tire at some point. He's going to feel the effects of being away from a serious and substantial race for him, for fitness-wise, since, for all intents and purposes, February. So for me, I don't agree with that. I'm sure there are some people now looking back on it and saying, well, if you just waited, maybe so. We'll never know. I don't agree with that. I think he was going to get tired no matter what and flatten out at the end of the race, in Louisville anyway. As far as this being the best war front in War of Will, thought that was an interesting part. And I did want to go through and look at some of the offspring that War of Will has had. And I don't know that I'm ready to put War of Will there just yet. I think he could ultimately end up being the best war front, but it's, to me, still too early to really put that on him. You're talking about a horse that's won 2 or 3 graded stakes races, the Lecomte, the Risen Star, and the Preakness. I loved his 2-year-old races. I've liked all of his 3-year-old races, really. But when you look at some of the other names, some other horses that were sired by Warfront, I think, you have a horse like Summerfront, so say what you will, but he was a really nice grass horse for quite some time. The Factor, maybe he didn't end up being what some people thought he would be, but boy, he was a Grade 1 winner. I believe he won the Malibu, and he has turned into a sire. He's done some good things. He has a number of good grass horses. I prefer the Factor offspring on the grass as opposed to the main track. And in my opinion, the best of the war fronts to date right now, I would probably still go with Declaration of War. Many folks will remember him as being that narrow defeat in the Breeders' Cup Classic out at Santa Anita a few years ago, but he won a few Grade 1s over in Europe at a flat mile, at a 1.25 miles on grass. To me, Declaration of War right now is the best war front. That doesn't mean that War of Will won't eventually become the best war front. But right now, I'm still gonna side with a horse like Declaration of War, and those other two that I mentioned. I think they both deserve to be right up in that sort of conversation as well. Randy Coger, apologize if I screwed that up. His comment, in the Bodie Express situation, I was impressed at his effort, even though he was not carrying weight. He was left at gate, 12 wide on first turn, 5 wide on second turn, then went out pony, tried to catch him at the 3/16 pole. He quickly moved clear and galloped out with energy. It's one of those things. I mean, look, I don't disagree here. I thought it was, do with it what you will. It was not a race from this horse, but I think it would be silly to think he didn't get anything out of it from like a fitness standpoint. I don't think this is all of a sudden going to make him, this little instance right here is not going to all of a sudden be the reason that he graduates in his next start or whatever the case may be. As I said in the recap, I think he needs to get into a maiden race. I think he needs to break his maiden and then go from there. He's better than your typical maiden. He is. But I still think we're at a point now where let's go baby steps. Let's go right back. Let's just get that first part out of the way. Get him some confidence, if nothing else. And then we can revisit the whole graded stakes situation. I'd like to see them get him into a maiden race, preferably sooner than later. Because again, I'm sure he got he had to get fitness out of this. He ran 1.25 miles basically. But to me, it's a scenario where get the maiden win, and maybe you have a horse ready to go for a stakes race, whether it's at Saratoga or any of those sort of scenarios. Keep in mind, I think everyone, especially Saratoga-wise, you think of races like, well, you got to go Jim Dandy Travers. Well, no, you don't have to. You could go to a race like the Curlin, which is restricted to horses that have not won a stakes or a graded stakes, one of the two. But either way, he fits the bill. To me, that would be a very nice sort of scenario where you get the maiden score somewhere. I don't care if it's New York, New Jersey, Florida. I don't care where it is. Get the maiden score for Bodie Express, and then look at your options. If he's ready to go, you don't have to go to the Jim Dandy. You can go to a race like the Curlin. Get another sort of confidence booster in. And if you believe that he is of the quality and the caliber of some of the best 3-year-olds, then you have a nice sort of path onto the bigger and better races, whether it's the Travers, the Pennsylvania Derby, anything like that. So it wasn't a race, but I think he probably got something out of it from a fitness standpoint. I still want him to just go through and get his maiden done. And the last one we'll touch on is probably the one that I was most... I don't want to say that I'm ranking the comments, don't get me wrong, but this one was one that I think is going to be most beneficial to discuss outright. Vincent Flauto, or Flauto. talking about the speed figure assigned. 99, exclamation point, question mark. I can't believe it didn't break 100. Andy Breyer, it's Andy Beyer, not Breyer. There's no R in there. Andy Beyer hates WoW, War of Will, and I'm sure he downgraded the fig. The proof being that was one of the 20 fastest Preaknesses in history. Does anyone know what Pletcher's horse got fig-wise? I believe he's talking about the Pletcher horse that won Sir Barton very early on in the card. His time was comparable to the Preakness. If that fig is over 100, then it proves my point. There's just so much in this comment, and I'm not trying to bash you, Vincent, but there's so much here that's just wrong. Let's start off. The way speed figures are made, and if you have not read it, you absolutely need to read Beyer on Speed before you actually can go through commenting on whether a figure is too high or too low, because if you've never read it, you don't really have a basis of understanding how the figure is created. I'm not going to give you the whole spiel, but a sort of condensed version. There are Beyer pars, and not just Beyer pars, but just any speed figures. There are pars that are set for tracks at different distances throughout, okay? And they've been accumulated for who knows how long. But they have pars, par times. As the races go on, you look at the final times throughout the day, and you see how much faster or slower those times are than the par. Now keep in mind, the pars are at different distances and also different class levels. So you basically have all your bases covered. They go through as the races are being run. You see how much faster or slower the times are from the par. Then that inherently gives you your track variant. The track variant is used then to create the figure for said horses on any given day. There are instances where throughout the day a track can either speed up or slow down. Then you will hear people discuss the idea that the variant is split because you can't necessarily compare the times from, this is not specifically talking about Saturday. Let's just use, random day at Aqueduct. You can't necessarily use the races from the first three on the day. Let's say there are 3 main track races at, different distances from the last 6 because the numbers are just so far off for the final 6 compared to the first 3 or first 4 and last 5, whatever the case may be. If the folks at Beyer Associates or Timeform US or whomever's making the figure, if they determine that the track either sped up or slowed down for whatever reason, whether it's weather or track maintenance or whatever the case may be, they'll then split the variance. So that's why sometimes the numbers will look a little bit different because the folks making the speed figures determined that the track changed as the day went on. There are occasional instances where there is some subjectivity involved, where if a time is just unbelievably off of what kind of par says it should be, and the rest of the prior figures, sort of the body of work of a horse, don't necessarily bear out that the horse is that fast or that slow, then there can be some subjective pieces taken into account where maybe the human element basically will go in and say, you know what, this wasn't actually a making up. It wasn't a 120. This horse has never run anything higher than a 101 in his career through 15 lifetime starts. There's reason to believe that it's not quite that fast. We will make the decision to downgrade it. In an instance like this, I said it in the recap. The difference between a 99 and a 100, you're splitting hairs. It doesn't make really that much a difference. I would have to go through and look individually at each race and see how things look from a time standpoint, and I can go into internal and see what, but for me, for the most part, you trust most of these figs. I say you start looking at different figs when they don't match up, when one figure, I don't care what it is, if it's anything that the racing form produces or if it's figures that are out somewhere else. If all of a sudden one is a little bit off or 2 are a little bit off, that's when you go through and do your due diligence and say, okay, well, why do I think this one is this way and these ones are not following suit? The other piece that we have to discuss is the idea that when you discuss the Pletcher horse and the figure that he got, it's not an apples to apples situation because that race was run so much earlier on a card on a day when there were hours between those races, and also from a distance standpoint. One race was at 1 mile and 3/16, the other was at 1 mile and 1/16. It's not an apples to apples comparison. If the variant was the same for both, you'd need to know what the par for the mile and a 16th race is and the par for the mile and 3/16ths and see how much faster or slower each of the final times of those two races were. There's a lot more that goes into it than just an arbitrary, it's a 95 or it's a 38 or whatever it is. And again, you're probably not going to get the entire sort of piece there from me just trying to quickly ramble it off. If you haven't read Buyer on Speed, you need to do so. And I'm saying this is a universal thing. Before you can really comment on a speed figure, whether you think it's too high or too low, if you have not read Buyer on Speed, I can't take that opinion seriously. You need to know the process that goes on to get to the figure before you can comment on whether you think it's correct or incorrect. So just a few things there that we needed to touch on, because I'm sure you're not the only one that looks at it and says something's a little bit off. So I appreciate all the questions, all the comments, everything. Again, you can leave them beneath the video player on YouTube for any of these pods, whether it's the preview or the recap or whatever it may be, or over on Twitter at Bernier_Matt. So with that, we'll put a button on it and we will transition into an early look at the possible field for this year's Belmont Stakes. You can head on over to DRF.com, and in the news and info section, you will find a tab for the Belmont Stakes. You click on that, you land on the Belmont Stakes landing page, which has at the top all of the videos that DRFTV has to offer that is pertinent to the Belmont, and then this list right here that we're taking a look at. These are all the horses that are currently possibilities for the Belmont Stakes. For those of you that are just listening and not watching, I will list them in order with their trainer, Everfast, trained by Dale Romans, Game Winner, trained by Bob Baffert, Intrepid Heart, trained by Todd Pletcher, Master Fencer, trained by Katsumi Yoshizawa, Owendale, trained by Brad Cox, Sir Winston, trained by Mark Casse, Spinoff, trained by Todd Pletcher, Tacitus, trained by Bill Mott, Tax, trained by Danny Gargan, and War of Will, trained by Mark Casse. There's a lot that can happen between now and when the Belmont Stakes is run or when entries are taken. There's a part of me that expects this list to expand between now and then. But I think more importantly for me, this part right here, it's just, I'm going to show you charts going all the way back to the 2010 Belmont Stakes. And I think the thing that so many people get stuck into, particularly the casual folks or the people that don't really pay a ton of attention, but they just get drawn into the big days, that the Belmont Stakes, everyone just thinks that because it's a mile and a half, any horse that's closing fast or has shown any sort of late interest is going to immediately appreciate added ground at Belmont Park. And from a running style standpoint, particularly recently, but I think it's a pretty fair statement, closing running styles do not particularly work well for the Belmont Stakes. The Belmont is usually a race that is run in a sort of grinding running style. It is my favorite by far of the 3 Triple Crown races, because I think there's a heck of a lot more strategy that goes into it than the crazy stampede that is the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, where it feels like it's a rather formful race. The Belmont Stakes, to me, there is more strategy involved. The distance is certainly a giant equalizer for a number of these horses. And there are certain trainers that have done better in races like this. The running style, to me, is the key for any contender for the Belmont. If the pace doesn't look like it's going to be just off the charts, and let's just look at these horses listed right here. I mean, if you're looking at this, perhaps a horse like Spinoff will be forwardly placed. Intrepid Heart probably forwardly placed. Outside of that, War of Will. Just if these are the horses that were going to run the race, it doesn't seem like the pace would be all that fast. And let's go back to the 2010 Belmont chart, okay? Now, again, for those of you that are listening, I'll do my best to just verbalize it all. Those of you watching, this is going to be a much more entertaining exercise. The chart from the 2010 Belmont Stakes, you'll note that this was a field of 12. Take a look at the pace, 24, 49, 14, and 4 for 3/4. Take a look at the running style of the top 5 finishers. The top 5 finishers at a mile into the race. So keep in mind that the calls are going to be slightly different given the fact that this race is just incredibly long. At the mile call, halfway into the race for the most part, I shouldn't say it's halfway into the race, it's 3/4 into the race, but this is an important call. Of the top 5 finishers, none of them were farther back than 6th. You had 1st, you had 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. The second place finisher faded quite badly. Interactive, who ended up being a grass horse. But the important thing to draw from this is it was not won by a horse coming from 100 lengths out of it. It was won by a horse in Drosselmeyer. Say what you will about his quality. He ended up being a Breeders' Cup Classic winner. He could be, I don't want to say close to the pace, but he was certainly not a dead one-run closer. Now, look, he had other instances where he did come from way out of the clouds, but he was a lot closer to the pace this day because the pace was as slow as it is in almost every Belmont Stakes. It seems very unlikely that you're going to get just these crazy fast half-mile, three-quarter, or mile calls. So this is an example of a race where basically if you were forwardly placed, if you're in the front half of the field, you more or less finished in the front half of the field. We go on to 2011. This was an instance where, keep in mind, the track was not great. It was a very wet year, a lot of rain. You're going to take a look at the fractions. 23 and 4, 49, 14 and 2 for three quarters, a mile and 39 and 4. Your winner was Ruler on Ice. Where was he at the mile call? He was in second by a length. Stay Thirsty. Where was he at the mile call? He ended up finishing second. He was third, a length behind Ruler on Ice. This is a race where those two horses were in great position throughout. Shackelford, who by all accounts, there was just very little chance of him being able to see out 12 furlongs. He only ended up fading to fifth. It was a situation where the horses that were closest to him, that had more pedigree to stay the distance, they did. It was a grinding finish. It was far from a visually brilliant effort. But Ruler on Ice and Stay Thirsty, they both were able to be close to the pace. It was a slow pace, but they were close. And you'll take a look. I wouldn't even consider Brilliant Speed a true closer. The horse that was trying to do some closing, now keep in mind, this was also the year that the start was a disaster for Animal Kingdom. The fact that he got as close as he did rounding the far turn, this was arguably one of his best efforts. He finished sixth in here. The only closer that did any running was Animal Kingdom, who was arguably the best horse of this crop. But nonetheless, for the Belmont Stakes, the top two finishers, they were second and third basically throughout the entirety of the run. Move on to 2012. You're starting to see a theme here. Union Rags, a mile into the race. Where is he? He's third. Painter, the runner-up finisher. He's first. He's setting the pace. It's a grinding sort of finish. Take a look at the fractions. 23 and 1, 49 and 1, 14 and 3, 38 and 4 for a mile. You seeing what I'm laying down here? The idea of a deep closer, whether in this race, an Adigan or a Street Life, they just had too much to do. And keep in mind, Adigan wasn't even coming from that far out of it. A mile into the race, he was in sixth, starting to make his move, but he just couldn't sustain that sort of bid. The idea of, in the Kentucky Derby, I firmly believe if you're a closer, you need to start making your move inside the half-mile call. Probably between the half and the 3/8 if you're going to have a chance to win. If you wait any longer than that, you're probably setting yourself up to come with just a giant finish, but it's going to be enough to get a small award. This is a race where those big, giant sort of moves, unless the pace is really hot or the quality is really poor, it just does not work. Move on to 2013. Another common theme. Take a look at it. Palace Malice. A mile into the race, he's third. Oxbow, the runner-up, he's leading a mile into the race. Orb tried to put in his big bid. At the time, he was in good form, and he flattened out. He just couldn't sustain that long bid. Take a look at the fractions here. Now, I'll give this one some credit. 23, 46 and 3, 10 and 4. Oxbow was cooking with gas out there on the front end. For him to only lose by 3 and 3, excuse me, got a little tickle in the throat. To only be defeated by 3 1/4 lengths, big effort from Oxbow here, but it just continues to sort of feed into the narrative of even with a hot pace, he still stuck around to round out your exact at 10 to 1. But Palace Malice, he had the tactical speed. This is a situation where the blinkers came off. He was much more into the run. He was much more relaxed. Wasn't sort of freaking out and run off speed like he was in the Kentucky Derby. So the fractions may have been faster, but running style still basically the same. You want to be relatively close. You don't want to have to do too much like an Orb where he just couldn't sustain that long bid. Move on to 2014. This is my first one with the racing form. I had medal count on top. I liked Commissioner in second. Well, where are they positioned? They're both in great spots. Tonalist was right there with him, though, and Tonalist just is able to get the job done over Commissioner. California Chrome, who even finished fourth. Take a look at his running style. They're all relatively close. A mile into the race, the top four finishers. Tonalist was third. Commissioner was first. Medal count was fifth. California Chrome was fourth. We've only seen really out of all these races so far, this is the fifth chart we've taken a look at, of all of these, we've really only seen one closer try to come in and do any sort of real damage, and that was Orb, and he finished third. He couldn't even get any more than that. Things will change the following year. When we take a look, excuse me, I shouldn't say that. 2015, things didn't change. 2015, American Pharaoh goes out there, struts his stuff, gets the job done. The thing I didn't talk about, though, with the chart for the tonalist year, take a look at the fractions. 24, 48 and 2, 12 and 4, 37 for a mile. Average at best. The American Pharaoh year. American Pharaoh is a little bit of a different breed. Obviously, you want to take this whole thing with a grain of salt. But again, take a look at the top 4 finishers and where they were a mile into the race. First, fifth, fourth, and third. Really not a lot of running going on from the back. 24, 48 and 4, 13 and 2, 37 and 4 for 3/4. You move on to the following year. This is the one where, call it perhaps a little bit of an anomaly, so far anyway, based on what I've shown you chart-wise. Creator is able to come from way out of it. And maybe it was just because he is one of the more well-bred horses for this sort of distance, or whatever the case may have been. Lonnie as well came from well off the pace. But take a look at Destin, who only was defeated by a nose. He was in second a mile into the race. Governor Malibu didn't have a great trip. I picked him. I remember it vividly. It's burned into my brain. He finished fourth. He was fourth a mile into the race. The fractions, 24, 48 and 2, 13 and 1 for 3/4, 37 and 4 for a mile. This might be a little bit of an anomaly with them coming from as far back as they were. Is it impossible to win closing the Belmont Stakes? No. Is it unlikely or more difficult? Absolutely, 100%. Tactical speed goes a long way. The following year, you take a look at this race. No surprise. Top 4 finishers a mile into the race. 4th, 1st, 5th, 3rd. Taprit, he prevails. He sees out the distance better than Irish Warcry. Irish Warcry, who was the pace setter in here. Pace setter, 23 and 4, 48 and 3, 14 for 3/4, 38 and 4 for a mile. And then you go into last year where we know what happened with Justify winning the Triple Crown. Gronkowski comes in with a giant bid. He just can't sustain it. He can't see it out, coming from way out of it. Hofberg even came from way out of it. But look at the fractions. 23 and 1, 48, 13 and 1. These are on par, or closer to anyway. These are the fastest outside of Oxbow's fractions. Goes to show Justify was a good horse. Goes to show it's very difficult, even with a faster pace, for those deep closers to sustain that bid and continue coming on. That's basically what I wanted to get clear and sort of get my point across when you're looking at these horses. And we go back to the list of possible entrants in here. You can't help but look at a horse like Master Fencer, and everyone saw that big finish from him in the Kentucky Derby. And could he win the Belmont? Absolutely he could. He could. Any of them could. Am I betting on it? Highly improbable. Highly unlikely. Simply because he's going to be so far back early on, or he projects to be so far back. And again, do not take this as gospel at this point, what I'm talking about with these horses in particular. Take those charts, what I'm saying, to heart. These horses, so much can change. An added pace horse can show up. There could be a defection, whatever the case may be. But I see a horse like Owendale. I think he's really talented. The lack of early pace concerns me in a race like the Belmont. Sir Winston, he is a true one-run closer. I just don't know that that's a running style that's necessarily ideal. War of Will, I think, is a beautiful running style for the Belmont Stakes. Tax has a beautiful running style. Tacitus, to me, he needs to be used a little bit more, because he's going to be a horse that I think will run all day, but I want him to be a little bit closer instead of having to come from so far back out of it. Spinoff would be kind of the crazy horse for me that I would consider already. If I'm looking at these horses and I'm saying a horse that has a little bit of early speed, the Derby I think was a little bit too much too soon for him. Who knows? The Belmont Stakes could certainly fit that bill as well, but I know he can be forwardly placed. Pletcher knows how to win this race. And Jose Ortiz, sure, he's going to be on Tacitus. I think Manny Franco rode Spinoff in the Kentucky Derby. Who knows who will be on this horse? But if you get someone that's familiar with Belmont Park, I think it's a situation where Spinoff could be kind of a wild card. In Game Winner, I'm just curious why he's been so far back in some of these races. I'd like him to be a little bit closer. If he could get closer, he's certainly a horse that's got something in there that could potentially win a race like this. So that's all I wanted to do. Touch on some of the horses, at least what this possible list looks like. You're always going to want to keep checking in with this. DRF.com. It's on the Belmont Stakes landing page. You can see who the latest are as far as possibilities and probabilities for running in the Belmont Stakes. But all these charts, I wanted to just sort of get that point across that we have a bit of a trend here. You need to be relatively close. You don't have to be on the lead. you got to be relatively close. The running styles that do well in the Belmont Stakes are the grinding, stalking types, not those beautiful, visually impressive, big flashes from the back of the pack. It's just a very difficult race to win that way. There will be much more to come on the Belmont Stakes. Probably going to have a few new shooter contender profiles sometime next week as we get closer and closer, and more names and more things become a little bit more solidified as far as that one is concerned. But it's nice to get an extra week between races here where we can kind of take a breath. First 2 legs down, 1 leg to go, and get ready. The Met Mile looks like it's going to be an absolute war on paper. Some of the horses that could show up in that spot. Belmont Stakes Day, always one of my favorite days. The Belmont Stakes itself is one of my favorite races of the year, and it's definitely my favorite as far as the Triple Crown races are concerned. We'll have much more to come as we get closer to the 2019 Belmont Stakes. However you've been listening to this thing, thanks for doing so. YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, video.drf.com, as well as Spotify. Wherever you're listening, please rate, review, and subscribe. Questions, comments, concerns beneath the video player on YouTube or directly to me on Twitter at Bernier_Matt. With the holiday on Monday, and I am off Tuesday, next week's going to be a little bit different. We may do a little bit of a joint recap preview on Thursday because there won't be 2 pods, I can tell you that much. It's just a matter of how are we going to position things. So it might be a bit of a recap and preview all wrapped into one. Might just be a recap. Who knows? We'll cross that bridge when the time comes. But just to give you a heads up, there will only be 1 pod next week, and it will come out on Thursday. So until then, good luck this weekend. Enjoy the holiday. Don't do anything stupid. Best of luck however you play, whatever you play, wherever you play. This has been the preview edition of the Matt Bernier Show.